Good morning, everyone. We're just populating our virtual meeting room as I speak.
Morning.
Great to see you all. My name is Anne Dixon. I'm the Director of the Chief Executives Forum. And on behalf of our chair, David Sterling, who unfortunately can't make it this morning, I want to give you all a very warm welcome. We're delighted to join with the Public Sector Chairs Forum this morning to convene this session. And I think the turnout that we see here this morning shows just how important this engagement is for colleagues right across the system. So we're very pleased that the Department of Finance facilitated this session for us. As a group and a system, we've talked a lot over the last 2 years about operating in uncertain environments. And it certainly seems like we will be continuing to do that for some time to come. So we're very pleased that Jeff McGuinness from the Department of Finance's Central Expenditure Division is with us today, and he's going to take us through the draft budget proposals as they were agreed for consultation. So Jeff's presentation will run for around 20 minutes, and so then we've got just over half an hour for a Q&A session afterwards. To help manage that, I'd be grateful if you could put any of your questions or comments that you'd like to raise with Jeff and his colleague Stephen Cross, who's with us from the department as well. If you could pop those into the Zoom chat function, and Heather Muirhead from the Chairs Forum and myself will moderate that session, and we do endeavour to get to all of the questions within the session. We are recording the session. We have a number of colleagues who weren't able to join us today, so they will be able to refer to that. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Jeff McGuinness from the Department of Finance. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, folks, and thanks for you guys giving up your time to engage with this session with us. A little bit of budget engagement. I have a short presentation that we'll do, or it might be a little bit longer depending on how long I speak for. I'll try and address where we've got to in terms of budget and kind of the next steps that are going forward in light of the recent events as well. So bear with me, I will try and share my screen and hopefully that will work. There we go. Okay, so in terms of our agenda for what we want to kind of cover this morning, I want to cover just generally the specifics on how we're funded and the background to that funding, look at a wee bit at the 22-25 financial landscape, talk a little bit about the budget timeframe, where we've got to so far, the draft budget outcome then that has been published for consultation, and the financial packages that we supplement our spending review position with, and a little bit about the Fiscal Council, and then the kind of the next steps position as well. So moving on to the how we are funded. Executive receives funding for public services from a number of different sources. As set out in this slide, the main source of funding comes from the Executive's block grant. This is the funding that comes from taxpayers, and it's received from Westminster via Treasury. Aside from this, the main source of locally generated funding comes from the regional rate. This is the element of the business and household rates that comes to the executive. It's approximately 50% of the rates bill that you pay, with the other 50% going towards local councils. In addition, the executive are able to borrow up to £200 million per annum under the Reinvestment and Reform Initiative, or RRI. This borrowing is for capital assets, so infrastructure, like of roads and buildings and transport and vehicles and things like that. Borrowing like this cannot be used to pay wages or fund day-to-day spend. The funding does have to be repaid, and you'll see those repayment costs later in the presentation. The executive continues as well to receive funding from the EU. That's primarily under the Peace Plus programme going forward. In addition, then the executive receives other income, primarily income from services that it provides, such as the likes of MOT fees. So you'll pay your MOT fee, and that income will be used towards paying for the cost of delivering those MOTs. Things like licenses as well are examples of where the executive receive income. And this income usually is for the service that it provides. So moving on then, to the Barnett formula. The amount of funding that we receive from Westminster is determined by this formula, or mostly determined by this formula. At each budget or spending review in Westminster, any changes to the level of spend in services in England is assessed using this Barnett formula. So the Barnett formula has two key components. The first one is that it's population-based formula, which means that if our population is 3% of that in England, then our funding, the additional funding that we would get, would be calculated on 3% of the funding provided to England. And secondly, then the formula is calculated on how comparable services are between here and England. So for example, if spend on health increased in England, we would get an increase on funding as health services are 100% comparable. Effectively, we provide the same health services here as they do in England. However, if spending is increased on international development, we would get no increase whatsoever because we don't have a comparable international development function here in Northern Ireland. So the formula is fairly straightforward to apply, but it doesn't take account of relative need. And by this, we mean that if the need, for example, for mental health services in Northern Ireland was twice as acute as it was in England, we wouldn't get twice the level of funding per head of population. So it doesn't take account of that relative need. Moving on then, just to cover the 22-25 financial landscape, the 2021 UK spending review set the overall envelope for the executive budget, and this slide sets out the funding provided through that exercise. The second table there in the slide, if you can see it, sets out the equivalent 21-22 budget position for comparison purposes. So as you can see, the funding for the 22-25 budget period is an increase on the 21-22 budget, but that increase is relatively modest. Additional information can be found in the draft budget document by following the link in this slide presentation pack, and we'll make this presentation pack available to you after this session. Moving on then, this just shows the core spending review outcome as well as a summary of the specific allocations and financial packages that we were provided. Specific allocations in this instance includes the likes of farm funding, which replaces the EU Common Agricultural Policy payments. It also includes funding to replace EU fisheries payments and funding for national security. These specific allocations are ring-fenced by Treasury, meaning that they must be spent for these purposes and they can't be used to address other pressures that the executive may have. So in addition to the executive's budget, it also includes, we've got funding for specific financial packages, and these will be covered later in the presentation, but just setting them out there in that slide for completeness. So as you'll see from this slide, the financial context does include the challenges of funding public services in the coming years, including the likes of pandemic recovery. How do we address that? The likes of cost of living increases and funding the health service. So some real key challenges in there. I've just given probably the top three in terms of what the executive might have to cover. And finally, just in this section of financial landscape, a final budget should be in place by the 1st of April 2022, and I've added a wee question mark there, and we'll cover some of that, the uncertainty around that later in the presentation. So in terms of time frame, this slide sets out some of the key dates in the budget process. You'll see there the spending review didn't conclude until the 29th of October, which meant that the local budget process here has been somewhat compressed, as an executive budget couldn't be developed until after we know the overall spending envelope. The draft budget was therefore not announced until the 13th of December, and given the importance of the budget then, there was a 12-week consultation period factored in, and that consultation period is due to end on the 7th of March. And again, a budget is required before the beginning of April, and that's one of the challenges that we face. And then just this slide here just sets out the draft budget priorities, and these are taken from the COVID-19 Recovery Action Plan that the executive agreed, and the 4 priorities of health, sustainable economic development, tackling inequality and green growth will be the focus of ministers over the budget period. And more information on that COVID recovery action plan can be found in the link within the presentation document. Moving to draft budget outcome, the executive has agreed a draft budget for consultation only. This is a novel approach by the executive, and it's reflective of the financial challenges facing all departments. As with any government, the executive's aspirations exceed the funding available, and difficult decisions will need to be taken as there simply isn't enough funding to do all that ministers aspire to do. In this context, consultation views will be critical as the executive finalise a budget. Set out next couple of slides or so will set out just the overall kind of draft budget outcome for departments. This one sets out the resource budget for each department. This is the funding that can be spent on day-to-day spend, such as pay, goods and services, rents, etc. You'll note there that the three biggest budgets are for health, education and justice. And then this next slide just sets out the capital budget equivalent. And it's capital funding, as I mentioned earlier, spending on infrastructure, roads, buildings, etc. That's what we have to spend our capital on. And you'll note that unsurprisingly here, the largest draft budget allocation belongs to the Department for Infrastructure. And this final slide in this wee section just sets out the allocations under a category of spend called financial transactions capital. This is funding that can only be used for loans to or equity investment in the private sector. In the draft budget, the majority of this funding is going towards housing association investment and business loans projects. And this slide just sets out the executive's prioritization of health in the budget. In the draft budget, you'll see that by 24-25, health is due to have over 50% of the funding available, and that by 24-25, health's budget will be 10% higher in real terms than its starting budget baseline. One thing to note is that the more funding that is directed to health, the less there is available for other public services. And then these next set of slides just set out the detail of how we're financed and then what we're spending that funding on. This reconciliation between financing and spending is critical for good financial management, and it's one of the reasons that the Fiscal Council acknowledged that the draft budget was a balanced one. This first slide shows the resource DEL financing, covering the elements set out in earlier slides. And then this second one just shows where we're spending that financing. The first half of the table sets out funding that is held centrally at the minute. That is, that it's not yet allocated to a specific department. You'll also see RRI interest costs that I mentioned previously. And finally, the departmental plan spend line, it's just a summary of the resource budget table that we'd set out earlier. And then this is the capital equivalent. One line that we didn't mention previously in terms of financing is funding that is coming from the Dublin government for A5. This reflects the contribution that they committed to as part of the New Decade, New Approach process. And then this next slide just sets out the capital spending. Funding for Magee Medical School and broadband is held centrally here, some of that anyway, pending further discussion with Treasury on the precise profiling across the budget period. So we'll engage with Treasury on that process and get that put into the years where we would be able to spend it appropriately. And then again, the departmental plan spend line is just a summary of the capital table that we'd mentioned earlier. And finally, then the reconciliation between financing and spending for financial transactions capital. And it just takes you through that with the spending on the bottom table there. £50 million in that spending table is set aside for allocation to the Northern Ireland Investment Fund. That's an independent body that works alongside government to invest in local projects. And further work will be needed by departments before we can allocate the unallocated funding. So departments are working on further projects and programs that would take up that additional funding. Mentioned financial packages earlier on. This slide just sets out the different financial packages that the executive have been provided with. Any funding that isn't held centrally has been allocated to departments in the draft budget for those purposes. And you'll see it's not an insignificant amount of money each year. Just maybe highlight the last one in that table, the city deals. The Belfast Region City deal was signed and announced just before Christmas, and this is part of the funding that that Treasury will provide towards our city deals, and the executive will also have match funding in there, and that'll be already assigned to departments. And then just a slide on the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. This just sets out some detail on that newly established Fiscal Council, which is an independent body that is set up to review the executive's budget and provide independent assessment of its sustainability. The presentation document here, these slides contain links to the relevant reports that it has produced. There's a very, very comprehensive one on Northern Ireland public finances that they had produced initially, and then on the 20th of January, then they produced one, a report on the draft budget, and it can be found through those links. And then moving on to next steps. This was the plan whenever I set this and put this presentation together, and we set up these consultation events. This was the plan. The plan would be that we'd be seeking views of stakeholders. The public consultation would end on the 7th of March. There would be a period of ministerial engagement after that, and then a final budget agreed by the executive and announced in March. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. With the resignation of the First Minister, the executive can no longer take decisions. It's not meeting, so it can't take decisions on budget going forward. You'll be aware that the Minister is taking legal advice on the budget process. There was a bit of media interest in that last night. I think Michelle O'Neill had announced that the Finance Minister had been seeking legal advice and is seeking legal advice on what can be done in the absence of an executive. And also then, as well as that, DOF and us as officials are reviewing the contingency arrangements that would be put in place. And I'll maybe just mention some of those contingency arrangements. I can find the notes on that one, make sure I get it right for you. So the Northern Ireland Act states very clearly that an executive is required to agree a budget before it's brought to the Assembly. And obviously with the executive not functioning at the minute, there's a real concern that we won't be able to bring a budget to the Assembly. And as I mentioned earlier, then the Minister's looking at legal options and what he can and cannot do, and we expect that advice to be given to us and clarified in the coming days. So if there is no executive budget agreement, what happens? And I think the first thing to state is that public services will continue. It's important to say to people that actually there are mechanisms in place that allow the provision of funds to public services to allow the lights to be kept on and processes to be kept going. So we can still take forward legislation that allows departments to spend money. So at the moment, there's about to be legislation introduced into the Assembly that will cover the 21-22 financial year and the end of it. And that legislation includes a clause that says that departments can spend up to 45% of their 21-22 cash and resources in the coming months of the new financial year. That'll make sure that departments can legally spend money from April onwards and that nothing grinds to a halt. So that will allow departments to keep public services operational till after the elections. Should an executive be formed following the elections, then it can pass a budget which will provide certainty for planning going forward. Should an executive not be formed following the elections, there is provision in the legislation for the Department of Finance Permanent Secretary to ensure that funding continues to flow beyond those first few months of the financial year through the use of powers contained in Section 59 of the Northern Ireland Act and Section 7 of the Government Resources and Accounts Act. It's important, I think, to state that these are contingency measures. They will keep the lights on, but they will not allow full budget planning for future years. Departments will be planning on keeping key services operational, but we will not be afforded the opportunity to have a full and agreed budget in place going forward without an executive to do that, unless we can find a legislative solution around that. So that's what the Minister is looking at going forward. He's going to take legal advice on that budget process and what it might look like. But if the worst happens and we can't put a budget in place, there are mechanisms that will allow us to continue to keep public services operational until such times as an executive is reformed and a budget is put in place. So what does all that mean? Well, in terms of our consultation, we have the consultation at this moment in time is still ongoing. It's due to conclude on the 7th of March 7th of March next month. But it may depend on what that legal advice looks like going forward. So we will take the view of our legal opinion, and the Minister will take a view on that. So it is in a state of flux, and I would encourage you to continue watching the news for how that plays out and what the implications might be for our budget going forward. So I think that covers all that I wanted to tell you and wanted to try and provide information on in this session. So what I'll do is I'll try and end my screen sharing and allow us to see each other and ask questions.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you very much. A really comprehensive run through the proposals as they've been set out in the consultation document. We have a number of questions coming in on the chat function, so I'd encourage everyone to continue to populate that. I'm going to go to Andrew Dougal first, who's the chair of the Public Health Agency. And Andrew, if you want to put your question to Jeff.
I think in recent months, CPI has been soaring and we don't know where it's going to end up. But usually health service inflation is even greater than that. Do we have any idea of the current level of health service inflation, so that we are able to understand how we will be able to deliver the same services, but with less financial resources?
It's a good question. I haven't been in touch with my health colleagues in the last few weeks on this particular issue, but certainly health service inflation runs at around 6%. So regardless of where we are, so there is already a significant impact on how we deliver health services going forward if we can't reduce costs within the health service system itself. And it's a question that we have to grapple with, and we have to then balance and try and understand how we finally provide a budget to them that will allow health services to be delivered, but also that transformation piece to happen so that costs can reduce within the health service and allow us to use our funding right across the system rather than more and more of it heading towards health.
I think it's important really that we have the skills and we're ready to try and deliver the same services, but with less resources in real terms.
Yeah, and it's a challenge for all departments to do exactly that, because we need to be able to deliver world-class public services, whether that's health or education or justice or whatever it is, in an environment where the funding that we have will need to be used much more strategically than maybe it has been in the past.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I go to Colin McKenna next? Colin has a question around the security of the block grant in the current circumstances.
Hi, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much for the presentation. Clear as always. I suppose I have a couple of things that one sort of very practical one that if I can throw one first, and that's really just, could we get a breakdown at some stage of the other income so that we can actually see just where that comes from. That might give us some food for thought as we move away, as we must, I think, from the super parity position that we've been in for some time. But my bigger concern, I suppose, is that I'm assuming that that the legal advice doesn't allow us to put in place the proposed budget without executive approval, which obviously won't be possible in the current circumstances, and therefore we base our spending, and I am aware of the formula, so we have 45% of the 21-2 spend. There was a significant uplift for the new 3-year period, and much of that weighted towards year 1. If we don't, if you like, get our act together, is there a risk that additional uplift may be lost and held on to by Treasury?
So I don't think there is much of a risk to that eventually, but it's how maybe the risk is around how strategically we're able to plan going forward into the next financial year. So the Budget Act that we are putting in place right now will allow us to spend up to 45% of the previous year. And then should we still not have an executive by the end of July, the Department of Finance Permanent Secretary can allocate up to 95% of the previous year. So we have a good period in which we can continue with public services until we get an agreed executive and agreed a budget in place. So obviously, the longer we go into the new financial year without an executive in place, the greater the risk is around that spend. But I would envisage that we would be, something would have to give politically at some point before we get to reach the end of the financial year. And so I don't think that there's a huge risk of us losing out. I think the risk is in how we strategically spend it. If we can't plan on a full budget from the 1st of April, there's obviously a risk around spending it in ways that we might not have done had we a proper budget in place.
Sure, I appreciate it. I suppose, Jeff, what I would encourage is to make, if we can collectively ensure that our executive ministers understand the risk, because you referenced the 2 dates there, after the 1st of April and then July. July will come quite quickly after the election in May, and I just would be concerned that there's not an understanding of what could happen. I agree with you. I don't think it will, but let's plan for the worst and be ready for the best.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Colin. Can I move on now to Michael McKavanagh, who has a question around EU funding and how it's going to look in the new system?
Yeah, thank you very much. Basically, Jeff, thank you. Very, very clear and illuminating for me, who's a relatively new kid on the block here. So thank you for giving me some education here. You mentioned EU funding and being replaced, particularly with reference to agriculture, I think was a sort of a reference when you went through the table. What I'm not clear on is if 100% across all departments of what was previously EU funded will actually be replaced. And if not, is there a shortfall, and has that been in aggregate totaled up across the 3-year cycle for all departments?
It's a good question, Michael. So in terms of EU replacement funding, the UK government have put in place the Shared Prosperity Fund, which was designed to replace a number of EU programs. Now, how that kind of leveling up and shared prosperity works is that the decisions are actually being taken not by executive here, but by London in terms of where that funding will be allocated. And I think it's a position that my minister has expressed frustration on a number of times, is that we're not sure whether we will get full replacement. We're not sure whether the funding and the projects that are agreed here will align with executive priorities. You might be aware of some of the concerns around funding in the Department for Economy, where they have said that there's I think it's £65 million or is it 85 million something. It's quite a big number.
I'm aware of that because I've seen that in the DFE papers, but I'm asking a broader question. I'm not making a pitch for DFE here. I'm actually asking the bigger question around, in aggregate, what's Northern Ireland's shortfall, if any, for everyone represented here. That's what I'm trying to get a handle on, which I'm not totally clear on.
Yeah, and to be fair, we're not totally clear on either, because it will depend on that shared prosperity fund and where it kind of comes in, and we're waiting and we're trying to engage with Treasury on that process. So we know that we have some concerns around how the farm funding was replaced, and that carry forward that the EU would have given us hasn't been replaced by Treasury's agreement. So we have concerns there. We have concerns, obviously, around the lack of funding for the likes of skills and the EU projects and programs there. But until we know that where the shared prosperity fund will hit, we're not sure as to what that number will look like.
Okay. So it's going to be a pressure point for everyone affected by it, anyway, regardless. Since 2% becomes something else if it's not solved to a level of 100%. That's the bottom line here.
Yeah, absolutely. There could be a real significant pressure there, and it might be met, it might not be met.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Jeff, for that one. I'm going to go to Sharon McHugh next, who has a question around funding for workforce planning.
Okay, thank you very much, and a very good presentation as always. I suppose my question is, and I suppose we're all very aware of the high level of vacancies across the whole of NICS and the difficulties there are about replacing staff, filling those vacancies. I suppose I always worry about trying to address that long-term problem with short-term funds. And whilst the cake is only a certain size, we're moving funds around and we're obviously prioritizing health at the moment. I suppose my question really is, it's very difficult to predict just how well we're going to be able to spend that money on staff. Is it going to be on short-term solutions? So is there going to be in your monitoring rounds to enable money to be moved around to address priorities when it comes to staffing? I think we didn't necessarily have that ability over the last few years. So is that something that's going to be a feature going forward?
Certainly, we would be planning on having some financial exercises in year to reassign and reallocate funding, and that would always be the plan. Now, in previous years where an executive hadn't been up and running, some of that was done by NICS board, to kind of tide us over. At this moment in time, we're planning for an executive to be reformed and them to take forward in your monitoring rounds, but obviously we'll be keeping that under review.
And in the absence of that, the contingency will be that the NICS board will address the issue. Would that be correct?
It's too early to say that at this moment in time.
Okay.
Certainly the contingency plans in place will only sort of be for a few months at a time as we go forward into the financial year, in the anticipation that we'll get an executive reformed.
Watch this space. Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Sharon. Can I bring Ryan Hoey in now, who has a question really on whole system planning?
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Jeff, for a very interesting presentation. My question is really, how does the Department of Finance look holistically across the departments? Because lots of the conversation about the draft budget has been, cuts in one area, funding health. But how do we move away from this zero-sum game and one department wins and another loses, to seeing how investment in one area can actually improve the situation across the board?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let me take you through the specifics of what we do within the Department of Finance as we kind of assess budgets going forward. So I'm part of Central Expenditures, part of Public Spending Directorate, and we see ourselves not really as the Department of Finance. We see ourselves kind of separated out. So we'll treat the Department of Finance just as another department of the 9, and the guys in Public Spending Director are very good at looking across the piece to see what the pressures are right across the system as we start to build up a budget picture and try and make recommendations to ministers. So that's what we do. I think there's probably a wider piece in what you're asking around in terms of program for government. So whenever we get an established program for government, that should be directing us to key outcomes, and regardless of who spends the money on what, we should be trying to improve the outcome for the citizen at the end point. And that's something that it's fairly difficult to tie back to budgets, but we have been doing a wee bit of work with the executive office on their programme for government work, so that we can try and start to think about how we align the budget to the outcome, and then it makes, there's less pressure on what the budget looks like and more pressure on what the outcome, how the outcome is improved for the citizen. So that's a longer term piece of work, but it is something that we are engaging with in the background.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. Can I bring Grania Long in now?
Thanks. Morning all. Jeff, that was really helpful. Thank you. My question is in relation to post-COVID, she said, hoping post-COVID backlog. And so look, all of us, every organisation I imagine in this room, we've seen, huge increases in demand for services in housing executive, obviously, particularly in relation to temporary accommodation. Some of that is entirely COVID related and will work its way through the system over the next 18 months as restrictions ease and so on. Some of it is permanent, but it feels to me like we need to kind of almost separate out and have a really good understanding across government as to what is COVID related backlog and how do we fund that in a strategic way, to Ryan's point, at a cross government level, so that we, in doing that, in working our way through that backlog, we're actually supporting health outcomes. Because quite frankly, if people are stuck in unsuitable bed and breakfasts and hotels because they're homeless, that will put pressure on the health budgets, because it's not good for them, it's not good for their health, it's not good for children's health. If I can move those people on quickly into suitable accommodation, then that will have a health outcome. But I think I'd really like to see more of a conversation about how do we had COVID-19 monies in the last number of years, they've stopped. That is going to cause huge issues, but we're going to have to replace it with something, and I'd like to do that strategically rather than it just be part of the general pot, because as you say, if we do that, I think, Jeff, we'll never get to where you want to get to, which is that strategic approach.
Yeah, but it's a very fair point, Grania. I mean, one of the things around budget was, and the spending review that preceded the budget was, we were unsure as to what funding might come along for COVID, and the reality is, at this moment in time, there's no additional money that the UK government have provided for COVID specific issues going forward. So what we have to do is we have to then take the budget that we have and do all the things that we wanted to do within the parameters of that budget. And that's why the executive's COVID-19 recovery action plan is so important, as ministers take their budget and then start to go, right, what are the priorities in here? How do we deal with that particular backlog? Are there things, as you say, that maybe have become the norm and aren't going to go away fairly quickly? And are there things then that, as you say, might flush through the system if we direct the resources appropriately at this right time to get back to a normal? I hesitate to say that because I don't think we'll ever go back to normal. But you know what I mean? So it's really important that the ministers will then take that COVID recovery action plan and focus on those key outcomes, the health, the sustainable economic development, so on and so forth, so that we can deal with this in a way that allows us to do it strategically. And that's all in the context of, we don't have an executive that will be able to agree a budget for the next year. So it's going to be even more challenging for departments to do that.
Thanks, Jeff. If I can just add, I mean, I think that's really helpful. And I think my reading of the COVID recovery planning is that it is ambitious, and that's great. And we want to see that level of it, and it cuts across green growth and all of the things that we want, and we know we have to get on with. I suppose if we don't think distinctly about that backlog, I don't think we'll get there, because you'll see organisations like mine just in emergency mode for far longer than we need to. And I want to get us, and I'm not just speaking about my organisation, but all of the organisations that we partner with, out of emergency mode and into that long-term strategic planning. But I think if we don't resource that, we won't get there. That's my sense of it right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a real tension there on resourcing as to how much we put to that to deal with it over the next 18 months or 2 years, and how much we need to kind of set aside for business as usual, so that's a real concern for all departments as they go forward.
Thanks, Grania, and thanks, Jeff, for that response. I'm going to come to Bernie Stewart in a minute on a related point to that last question, but I think I might have missed a question. Rosemary Stalker. Rosemary, if you're there, if you want to come in.
Thank you, Anne. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Jeff, thank you very much. Great presentation. Challenging times ahead. I've got two questions, please. What do these interim budget arrangements mean for city deals? Are we able to meet those commitments? And the second question is, I've heard that we cannot make new commitments through these interim arrangements. What does that mean if Invest, does that mean Invest cannot write new business?
A couple of good questions there. So in terms of contingency arrangements for the likes of for capital, let's deal with maybe capital, which is kind of where we are in terms of the city deal. So that kind of funding, whenever we put in place contingency arrangements, and we might not have to, an executive might reform, but if we're in the position where we need to put in place contingency arrangements from April onwards, one of the things that we will look to departments to do would be to deal with all their contractual commitments and make sure that they have sufficient funding to deal with all of those particular contractual commitments, and as well as that, all the executive commitments that have been in place as well. So we would very much see city deals as it's been signed and agreed just before Christmas. That's an executive commitment, and we will be putting in place the funding to allow that to continue. So that's that bit dealt with. The other bit, sorry, remind me what it was.
With regard to writing new business, so Invest has pipelines of projects, running for 3 years, FDI deals that we've been working with people on for years. But if they haven't been approved at this point in time under these interim arrangements, can we write new business? So
yeah, there will be a very definite balance to be taken by accounting officers in departments as they go through and they consider what the contingency arrangements mean for them. They'll be working off a budget that is a little bit lower than what potentially a draft budget might have been, because we can't really say, we can't make decisions now that bind the hands of an incoming executive, but we will be able to look at a baseline for them and create some sort of baseline for them to allow them to make at least some planning, and it just depends then on within the wider department what they consider as a risk and what they consider as being able to be acceptable risk within that sort of baseline position that they'll be working to. And I say I hopefully will not be in that position, but if we are, then it'll be a balance for the department to strike as to how much we can they can put to new business within that contingency budget that they might have, or that kind of planning position that they might have.
Do you see that as going to be within the scope and empowerment of the accounting officers within the departments to manage within that slightly reduced amount under that contingency framework?
Yeah, I'm kind of just reverting back to what we had done previously, whenever we didn't have an executive in place, and it was accounting officers that were able to take decisions, on budgets within their, or financial decisions within their gift, within their department. So we will still, and this is still a work in progress, and we'll still be looking at how we do that. I think PSS was meeting, permanent secretaries were meeting today to discuss things like this. So there's not a settled position, and I can't really give you a settled position. I know that's probably quite frustrating. I'm just going on what had happened previously and what that might look like going forward. So maybe is the answer. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. Bernie, if I could come back to you now, and a very interesting question, particularly around green growth in the context of the legislation that's on its way through the Assembly at the minute, and what funding requirements it might put on DAERA and others.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thank you very much for an interesting run through of that. I think what strikes me, and it's what happened the last time, is that the ticking over of keeping the lights on really means you just continue the routine stuff and takes away from all the transformation agenda. So I suppose I'm worried about initiatives. Green growth is an example, but there are plenty of transformations in the health service and elsewhere that need investment now to be able to make things run smoothly in the future. So will there be money available, as there would have been in the draft budget, to do new things like green growth? Because if that isn't spent now, then that affects the budget in future years, and the carbon neutral won't happen, basically, if you don't start now. So are we inhibited from doing those transformation initiatives in the absence of an executive?
It's a good question, and it's probably bound up in the legal advice that our minister is seeking and will kind of consider over the coming days as to what that might look like and how far things can go. I mean, I imagine without an executive to agree the finalised budgets, then there are risks to new things coming on board. There's probably, that's just the reality of it. But you know, we're working in the background to do as much as we can to ensure that public services can be delivered in the best way that we can within the framework that we have. But yeah, we'll maybe know more in the coming days as the legal advice is provided and considered. I mean, that doesn't answer your question. I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's as much as I can say, because we really are bound up with what we can do legally.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
Thanks. I'm going to hand over to Heather Muirhead shortly, who has a question, and we'll be wrapping up for us at the end for the Chairs Forum. But Colin, can I maybe bring you back in there on the point you've made around the PFG, Colin McKenna?
Yeah, it's just a question. Thanks, Anne. And Jeff, you may not have the answer to this, and I appreciate the ultimate responsibility around PFG does sit in the executive office. But I mean, technically, as I understand it, we can't really do or shouldn't really be agreeing about it without a programme for government being formally agreed. You know, one follows the other, if you will. But where are we on the programme for government? And should there not be some discussion, even at next board and official level, around where we need to get to? Because an awful lot of these cross-cutting issues that have been referenced by a number of people, by Rand, by Grania, and others, could be started to be addressed within these discussions if we address that properly. But have we any idea where we are timeline-wise in terms of what might be ready for an incoming executive?
I don't know offhand. I'm not close enough to Programme for Government to know exactly where we are in the timeline. I do know there had been drafts being discussed behind the scenes, and I did notice as well then the leader of the DUP did say that he would prefer a Programme for Government in place before a budget, which is the technically the right way to do it. So I suspect then that should an executive be reformed, that'll be their, you know, the Programme for Government team will be standing at the door in line on number one, and I'll be standing right behind them with the budget at that stage. But I don't know where the specifics of the Programme for Government are at the moment.
Well, I sincerely hope, yeah, if they are standing at the door waiting for the executive, there's something in their hand to give to them. And that's my slight concern, that there hasn't probably been enough discussion around some of these things. You know, I think people may have picked up on the media yesterday, the Chief Constable in giving evidence to the Justice Committee and quite a bit of the work that goes on there, which has taken some of the pressure off the health service, and it's the ability for you know, if we need to start building these things in to thinking around PFG.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And certainly, I think on behalf of both the Chief Execs and the Chairs Forum, we will continue to try to make those connections with TEO as they develop those plans that they will be hopefully putting on a First and Deputy First Minister's desks. Heather, I'm going to hand over to you now, because you've one of those really interesting and difficult questions that's worth putting to you, Jeff. And I know you'll want to wrap up from the Chairs Forum point of view as well. And anyone else who wants to pop in a late question, you've got a couple of minutes to do so.
Thanks very much. We were trying to upload, we've done a response. Colleagues will know I work for the Confederation for Health and Social Care. So we have a budget response, because even with the 10% uplift, actually with all the in-year, that was 10% on baseline last year, it doesn't even touch the sides. So you'll see that all of the work that we want to do, although it looks like a very good picture, it's really not. And obviously, if we revert back to that 45%, Jeff, that makes it very, very challenging in the health environment. So we'll put, we can't get it up in the chat, but we'll either send it around with the slides so people can see just the extent of it. I think my question builds sort of on what Colin and Bernie were saying, in that you know, often when you do these exercises, it's bring out your dead. Everybody brings out what they need funded. But again, if you speak to some of the colleagues in health, we're very bad at stopping things. And so we're innovating. Do you think that we're spending enough strategic time, Jeff, really thinking about where the things that we can stop that we're spending on that are low added value, or where else we can spend? And I think there's a term for this I've come across recently is exnovate. So we're happy to talk about innovate, but exnovate is quite important as well.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get no arguments from me with my kind of in my ivory tower with my budget, is to say we would always be encouraging departments to look at what they're doing, to reassess that, and to be critical of things that maybe aren't working as well as they expected them to, or things that aren't being measured, because maybe if you're not measuring it, does it matter? You know, that's very blasé, and I wouldn't apply that as a rule of thumb anywhere. But effectively, you know, is it important enough that you need to keep doing it, and it needs to keep on going? And if not, well, why not? What are you doing about it? Are there things you can stop? So it is something that we, I say in our ivory towers, you know, encourage departments to do all the time. And ultimately those are issues for departments to get to grips with, and issues for departments to kind of bring before their ministers to make decisions on. And there will be, you know, I could sort of, you know, point to a few things and say, well, I think this, but I don't know all the information, and therefore the people who are best placed to make those decisions are the ones that are sitting in departments. But certainly we would encourage people to do that. We have encouraged people to do that. The likes of the Fiscal Council and the Fiscal Commission are making good strides to take that independent view of where we are, and really encourage departments to kind of think about what that looks like. You know, the Fiscal Commission will be looking at revenue raising and things like that, and that will put a spotlight on what we're doing and what we're doing maybe compared to other areas. And as well as that, you know, we've always, you know, we encourage departments to kind of look at what the audit office are doing in terms of their reporting on good budget financial management, and how can we improve that, so that we're maybe not necessarily stopping things in that way, but we're actually improving outcomes, and we are doing stuff, you know, things for less money. So we'd be encouraging departments to kind of you know, focus down on those particular recommendations as well.
That's brilliant, Jeff. Just to say, I know that most colleagues on the line will know that really a much broader version of this conversation we want to be having on the 23rd of February, which is the Northern Ireland Leadership and Governance Conference. So this is a microcosm of many of the things that we'll be talking about, because we'll have the Fiscal Council there, we'll be looking at city deals, the university will be looking at innovation and governance and leadership, about how we begin to build those collective conversations around some of these issues. Frank, you just wanted to come in. Frank Bryan, see, from Belfast Met. In the chat.
All right. No, it's just, I think my comment probably says all I need to say. I just, along with many colleagues, get very frustrated at what might be a very simplistic compromise across budget, which misses the point in terms of, I think, Jeff, you put it very succinctly up front, around the focus on the outcomes. And if we are generally focused on outcomes, I mean, this very crude element of draft budgeting just doesn't cut it. And the idea that even if you look through the lens of health and well-being for citizens across Northern Ireland, the answer does not lie exclusively within the Department of Health. To some extent, the Department of Health, for all the wrong reasons, focuses on fixing people. I mean, if we could to adopt a more proactive approach and actually helping and supporting people so they don't get to that point in many respects, would be money well spent. And my little sort of nod towards skills in the economy is that, no, we can't simply always look to the block grant to solve all our problems. It's through growing the economy and through success and prosperity and profits, there will be taxation that will allow us to sort of hopefully find additional sources of funding to reinvest and build the public service we want. So I'm really just amplifying my little comment, Draw. I prefer to look on it as a statement of the obvious, but an ambition maybe to say, look, let's get better at how we do budgeting with a clear focus on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Thank you.
That's brilliant, Frank. Kieran Donnelly's with us. Kieran, do you want to just make a comment on sort of from where you're standing? You're on mute, Kieran. Sorry, I jumped on you there. Sorry, sprang on you.
So, hello.
That's you.
What? Right. We did quite a simple exercise, just comparing just how the whole budgetary process here works against the benchmark of OECD good practice. I was at the Public Accounts Committee yesterday, and they're going to produce their own report on this, but a lot of the points was mentioned today, all of them resonate, particularly the need in the medium term to get that alignment between the programme for government and the budget. We haven't had that for any time in the recent past. That's so basic, but that's one of the first things that needs to be done. We're not anywhere near there yet. So that's hugely important. There's other things that are mentioned today, yeah, about Heather, you mentioned that having a hard look at, well, what can we exit from? And I think there is a need. In fact, the Finance Committee of the Assembly, as long as 10 years ago, recommended that, you know, there should be a sort of benchmark and exit, go back and do a bit of zero basing around programs. I think there's enormous scope for looking at things, but there's so much in the way of vested interest. And I think to do that properly, you need a bit of independence in that sort of process, a bit like Project SNP that they had in the south of McCarthy, I think, when needs must. But when you take a hard look at things, sometimes I look at parts of the public sector that employ 600-700 people. My first question is, what do they all do? Maybe what they do was all relevant 10 years ago, but has anybody had a hard look at it? And without going into any particular parts of the public sector, I can tell you there's probably half a dozen areas where you know, resources could be released to go somewhere else. But I think there needs to be a more systematic way of looking at that. There's so many vested interests want to protect their bit. So there needs to be a hard look at where we can act, where maybe fairly big organization existed in the past and the need no longer is as pronounced as today. The other thing was mentioned there was the loss of, I suppose, EU structural funds. A lot of mention of the shared prosperity fund. And some of you might know that the Institute for Government has done a very interesting report on that, really saying there needs to be better communication with the devolved regions on the whole accountability setup. And there is a risk of sort of duplication. So, and I don't know the answer to what extent, that was a good question, as to the loss of structural funds, to what extent that's going to be made up by the shared prosperity fund. That's a bit of a mystery so far. But the Institute for Government was saying there need to be far, far better communication with the devolved regions on how the accountability for that would all work. So I think a lot of what was said today, I didn't come in to say anything because I was agreeing with nearly all the points at issue.
No, that's brilliant, Kieran. It's just helpful to have that reflection about what best practice is. We're just out of time. Can I just really thank Anne and the guys at Chief Execs Forum for organising today, and Jeff and Stephen, brilliant job. That there's a lot of information to get, and we will send the slides because I know that people will want to study those. But I do think that these conversations are really helpful because you don't often get the crossover and really trying to understand where you fit in the other bits of the system. So we hope that today's conversation gives a bit of a perspective of that, and we'll pop those around. So a massive big thanks to everybody who asked questions and animated, and hopefully again we'll send the slides around. We'll also link back to a conference because I do think we'll have a lot more deeper conversation about some of these things then. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.